Hello and welcome to our 5th episode. Today we're going back to Southern California, but up to the remote mountains where something evil lurks. So please, come in, take a seat, have a drink, and relax. Before I start the story, I need to give some background on the area. For those of you who don't live in Southern California, there are a few mountain ranges that are mainly tourist ski spots. However, what some people don't know is that there are multiple little towns all over the mountain which are not tourist locations but true to form small towns. The one I will be talking about is a town called Running Springs. Part of the town does sit on the main road heading to Big Bear, but the town only gets minor tourist traffic. Most just stop at the stores for supplies, or some of the ridiculous high gas stations, which are higher during tourist seasons because of the second gas station to Big Bear is 20 miles away, which with traffic and the windy roads can take up to an hour to 2 hours just to reach. Now, tourist season is obviously during the winter time when snow hits the mountaintops, which the residents usually just bunker down as the main roads are cluttered with inexperienced California drivers who never drive in the icy roads and are constantly getting into car accidents. During the summertime, there's a lot less traffic, but still a pretty good amount of tourists come visit the large mountain range. It attracts all kinds of people, like hikers, campers, outdoor enthusiasts, and even recreational shooters who use BLM land. But all this tourism accounts for the whole mountain, which is over 813,000 acres. The story I'm about to tell you was told to me by a female Forest Service officer named Jess. I met her mainly by accident and necessity. I moved up to the mountain after living in Temecula, which is the valley, for over 2 years and absolutely hating it. At the time I was renting, and plus the cost of utilities and even gas was making life pointless as I felt I was only working to pay the bills. Eventually I got a contracting job for a biopharmaceutical company, and I was looking for places to live closer to the job. I was shocked to find out that the rent was even higher up there. If you listened to episode 1 and 2, then you've heard me complain about how expensive it is to live in California. I'm not trying to be repetitive, but some of the decisions I made was based on the cost of living in certain areas. I also want to state that I no longer live in California, and I really couldn't be happier. Now back to the story. I didn't want to move close to the work site, as the cost of living was more expensive there, and even with my raise, it would end up me feeling the same as just working day to day just to pay the bills. So, I began doing some research and I found out that living in the mountain was cheaper than anywhere I've ever seen in Southern California. Not only that, living in a small town surrounded by beautiful forests and a weather that was almost 20 degrees cooler made me feel like I was living in the Midwest again. So long story short, I found a rather cheap home to rent and even began saving up for a new home. Now the drive to work was rather long. It takes over a half an hour to get to the bottom of the mountain and an hour to get to work, which if I was to leave during rush hour, it could take me up to 3 hours just to get to work. I learned my lesson after the first time of being late and my boss being mad at me. When I first moved up to the mountain, I did so at the tail end of winter. The snow was mostly melted with small piles on the side of the road. What I didn't know, because I was new to the mountain, was a snowstorm was coming in the next few days after I moved in. I ended up getting snowed in my home. My power was shut off, no firewood to keep me warm. I did go outside and gather some wood from some trees in my yard, but as anyone who lives in the cold knows, in order to stay warm you need to constantly burn firewood, which I didn't have an abundance of. If I was not clear about this, all the roads were snowed in, and plows work very slow on the mountain, mainly focusing on the main roads. Not only that, the snow was still falling, which meant even if the plows came through, it would only be a matter of time before the roads were covered with white again. Thankfully, my phone was fully charged before the power went out, and I had the tiniest bit of signal. I went on the local pages and began asking for help. Almost instantly, a neighbor who lived a few streets down heard my request and in moments came down the road in a snowmobile, towing a large tarp of wood and carrying her own backpack full of canned food. I felt so grateful. I offered her multiple times to pay her, but she insisted that the town looks out after one another. She explained that besides being prepared, you need to continue to check up on the weather as it can snow almost any day. She also informed me that I should invest in a generator, have 2 weeks of food and water, and also order a quart of wood, which is basically a whole tree, once a year. A little bit about the woman I'm talking about. Her name is Jess. She was short, 5'5" woman, long brown hair, in her early 40s, a little bit curvy, but rather in shape. She was very kind and sweet, and always held a smile, no matter the conversation or situation. She spent her whole life on the mountain and loved the forest so much that when she graduated high school, she quickly joined the Forest Services and became an officer. She's been working there for over 20 years to this day. After 3 years of living on the mountain, we not just became close neighbors, but close friends. We took care of one another, celebrated holidays together, and even went on vacations together. We became so close that I told her some of the strange stories I've shared on this page, and even some you haven't heard yet. I could tell after each story I told her, Jess wanted to talk about something. However, she never said anything. At the time, I assumed it was just embarrassment, or maybe she felt like my stories were lies, and she fought herself from even calling me one. But now I know it was just fear. Eventually, after some time, she began to tell me some unusual things that she saw in the woods. Some of these stories will get their own videos, but there was one story that truly made me fear for living on the mountain. Okay, so before I tell you this, I need you to promise never to tell anyone, Jess said seriously, but still with a smile. I promise I won't, I said, grinning back at her. She quickly breathed out a deep breath and began her story. When I first started, I was 19. I finished my training and began my first week. She picked up her wine glass and took a sip before continuing. They did not give me a whole lot of responsibilities up front. I basically was in charge of the office, making sure it was clean and the notice board was up to date and helping tourists with directions. As she told me the story, I could not help but notice how the similarity in government jobs could be. Even in the military, lower ranks always have to do the dirty work. It's just funny thinking that cops, firefighters, and maybe even politicians have to go through something similar. It wasn't until a few months in I was finally allowed to patrol the forest, but it was also when the temperature dropped and was freezing out. So the new officer, which was me, was out in the cold while everybody else was in the warm, clean office. There was also a lot less tourists, so there wasn't much going on. She continued to explain that for the next few years, she was slowly given more responsibility and eventually had enough experience that she was given her own section of land to patrol. It was a massive 400 acres, mostly hiking trails and some camping spots. She usually stayed on the trails as they were safer and was normally where she was needed. She dealt with loads of different people and problems, mostly hikers lost on trails, campers without fire permits, or even campers with fires during the dry season. Occasionally she would deal with squatters trying to live off the campsites, but by law they were only allowed to spend 2 weeks at a time. It was a normal day in spring. She was making her rounds, checking campsites, and driving down the trails in her white and green Park Service truck. On this particular day, she decided to get out of her car and stretch her legs. Jess decided to continue the trail on foot as her truck could not fit. As she continued down the trail, she took in the fresh air and the beautiful scenery, and for those few moments, her job was perfect. Sadly, things were about to change. The first thing she noticed was the smell of burning wood. She began to panic, rapidly looking around, hoping the forest wasn't set on fire. She quickly followed the smell, which led her off the trail and deeper into the woods. Soon, orange and blue colored tents became noticeable in the distance. As she approached, she saw the small flames and black smoke billowing out. She quickly ran over to the lit fire and began to kick it out, throwing mountains of dirt, extinguishing the fire. As she began to catch her breath and her panic began to cool down, her head began to swivel. searching the site for occupants. With only moments of calmness, she is yet again sent into a panic when a scene of horror becomes clear. Both tents wide open and containing scattered remains of what used to be a camp. The blue tent had visible signs of blood and was ripped apart from top to bottom. But the worst thing that caused her to run back to the trail and to her truck and call for backup was the sight of a bloody woman laying in the orange tent. She did not examine the body, as she was thrown into fear, which caused her to run. But what she did remember, besides the pool of blood, was the multiple large lacerations that appeared all over the woman's naked body. As she got to the truck, winded again, she grabbed her radio and began frantically yelling for help. Her call was answered by a deep man's voice that she recognized as her boss, Jacob. The man asked her to calm down and explain the situation. After taking a few breaths, she was able to say her location and that she found a body of a bloody woman in a tent in the woods. Jacob quickly replied and told her to stay at the truck and that help was on the way. She followed orders, remaining at the truck, but panicking, walking back and forth, trying to understand what she just saw. She repeatedly told herself that maybe the woman was okay and it was not as bad as it seems. After about 20 minutes, both a police SUV and another parked service truck pulled up to the trail. She was expecting a larger response, with ambulances, more police, maybe even a helicopter. But in those moments, she continued to think positively and believed more help was on the way. The officer who got out of the SUV was an older man with light gray hair, a sizable beer belly, and wearing a dark blue police uniform. Following behind him, coming from the park service truck, was Jacob, her boss. He was very tall, at 6'3", compared to the short 5'5" woman. He had a dark mustache and was very thin. "Jessica, right?" the older man asked. "It's Jess," she said, instantly feeling stupid for correcting him, as her full name was Jessica. "Right. Well, Jess, I'm Sheriff Daniel. I heard you may believe you found a dead woman?" he said in a stern voice. "Yes, but no. I mean, she might be alive," she said nervously. Both Jacob and Daniel looked at one another, then back at the freaked out woman. "Right. Can you take me to her?" he said with his arms raised out, signaling her to show him the way. Jess began nervously walking towards the camp, each step causing her heart to race faster and faster. As they moved in a few feet from the camp, Sheriff Daniel put his arm out in front of Jess, causing her to stop. "Just stay here, we'll check it out," the sheriff said, as him and Jacob continued to the tents. She continued to panic, but tried to remain calm. She tried to distract herself by looking around the woods around the campsite. In the sea of brown and green, Jess saw what looked to be red spray paint on a tree. She slowly began to walk towards the tree, and as she got closer, she was surprised to find a 5-pointed star with the top point facing down. She instantly knew the star was of satanic nature, but she noticed that it was in the center of a triangle, and each point had some strange symbols. "Jessica," Jacob yelled, causing her to jump and letting out a small yelp. As she held her chest and turned to her boss, she began to point out the strange symbol on the tree. "Looks like teenagers tagged the tree. That happens a lot here," he said, looking at the tree, then back at Jess. "I'm afraid the woman's dead," he said, as if giving the news to a family member. Jess's heart began to drop, as her fear had become true. "I want you to head back to the office. Take a breather, then take a few days off," Jacob said. "What about the woman?" Jess asked, not even registering what her boss just said. "We'll have some guys come out and get her body and identify who she is, and hopefully inform her family," he said, still in a sorry toned voice. The next few minutes, hours, and even days felt like she was in a fog. Her brain struggled to register the torn-up woman she found in the woods. Her job, which was truly a walk in the park, now felt like a nightmare. She ended up taking more than a few days off, but as she finally accepted what she saw, she continued to push positive thoughts and return to work. "Hey Jess, how you feeling?" Jacob asked in a caring tone. "I'm doing okay. I just need to get back to work and get past this," Jess replied. Jacob nodded his head, and just as she wanted, work continued the same. She checked the campsites, the same trails, but never walked off the trails. She quickly became her old cheery self, and life continued. Until one day, as she was preparing to leave the station to continue her route, her heart sank once again. On the notice board, staring right at her, was a photo of the dead girl. Under that, in large print, said, "Missing." She quickly ran to her boss's office, wide-eyed, and said, "Jacob, there's a sign for that dead girl. It says she's missing." Jacob, with shock on his face, stood up, walked out the room, and Jess followed behind him. As he approached the board, he stared at it for a few moments and turned back at Jess with a smile on his face and said, "That's not her." "Yes, it is, I remember," Jess said, being cut off. "No, you think that's her, but that's a different girl," Jacob said now, with more stern in his voice. "But," Jess said, but was cut off again. "Look, if you're still struggling with what you saw, then maybe this job isn't for you." Jess's heart stopped, but before she could reply, Jacob continued, "A lot of people go missing here. It's a huge forest. On top of that, there's animal attacks, like what happened to that girl. Sometimes you may see things, and I know they stick with you, but if you want to keep this job, then you need to move on." Jess's mind raced with thoughts, but scared of losing her job, nodded her head and smiled. "Good. Now, go keep the forest safe," Jacob said with a smile. Even though Jess was scared of losing her job, she knew without a doubt that the woman on the poster was the one she found in the woods. She became even more suspicious when the next day the poster was gone. She remembered Jacob saying that a lot of people go missing in the forest. Of course there was truth to this, but she wondered how bad could it be. She watched the news and even read newspapers, and it never saw articles about missing people in the forest. This caused her to begin doing research, and to her surprise, hundreds of people go missing every year in the San Bernardino mountains. Not only that, she found full podcasts and online articles about mysterious disappearance of these people, each source having their own theories as to why. Some said aliens. One said there was a secret military base in the woods that did experiments on the people they caught. But only one article really captured her attention. There, in the center page, a photo of a wooden sign. On that sign was a triangle with 3 symbols on each corner. There was no pentagram, but she knew without a doubt it was the same symbol. Unlike the other articles, this one was specifically about missing children from a boarding school on the remote part of the mountain. The article was short, but stated that the boarding school was investigated after more than a few dozen kids were reported missing by their parents. The article stated that the parents who sent their kids to the boarding school after some time never heard from them. Because of this concern, they went to the school to see their children, but was told by the staff that their child was never registered there. When the police investigated the school, it was said that many of the kids were abused, but the article did not get specifically into what kind of abuse. The school was shut down, but no arrests were made. The article also stated that it was never reported on by the news, and to this day they still don't know what happened to the kids. Jessica's head was reeling. How was the school connected to the missing people? Why was there symbols on the tree where the butchered woman was? Is her boss involved in this? As she planned on what to do next, she decided she needed to go back to the school and get answers for herself. As she tried to locate the school online, she was unsurprised to find out that there wasn't a single bit of information where it was. She spent the next few days thinking of the best way to locate the abandoned school. She thought about asking her boss, but at the very least she would lose her job, or even at worst end up like the woman in the orange tent. After a while, she began to look at old records in the office. Yet another strange thing she found was that there was no report filed for the dead woman. In fact, there was no reports for any dead bodies or missing people. This stuck out to her, as Jacob stated that they stumbled upon bodies multiple times and that there was a large number of missing people. Why wouldn't there be reports for this? The thoughts danced around in her head as she continued looking until she finally stumbled upon an old map in the back of the filing cabinet. At first, the map looked the exact same as the one hanging in the office, until she noticed the date at the bottom of the page. It was over 20 years old. As she quickly checked the map on the wall, a familiar number appeared at the bottom. It was the same year the article said the school shut down. In that moment, she realized the map had been changed. She rushed out the door to her truck and headed to a remote part of her route. She did this in fear that her boss would walk in on her and see her checking the old map. She looked up and down the map, and it took quite a while, but eventually she found a road on the map that she never noticed before. To her surprise, yet again, the mysterious road just so happened to be in Jacob's sector of the woods. She knew she could not just go check out the road during the day, as she had a greater risk of running into her boss. Jess concocted a plan and continued her day normally. Later that night she returned, not in uniform and in her personal car. She knew the night officer took lunch around 10 p.m. She parked in a lush area which she believed her black car would not be noticeable. Jess knew very little about the area she was entering. The only thing Jacob ever briefed her about is that they had no trails or campsites, but they still need an officer to patrol the area, as tourists have a knack of being places they're not allowed. As she slowly began to walk the only visible path, the thick forest began to drown out the moon's light, forcing her to use a flashlight. She did her best to shine the light only on the ground in front of her, but she knew that even then, she was noticeable, even from far away. Jess continued to walk the trail until reaching where the road should be. As she approached, she noticed a sign on a tree stating no trespassing private property. This was strange because this part of the forest was particularly all national forest. She breathed in deeply and continued on the road. After a few minutes, the thick forest began to part, and as the moonlight shined in front of her, she turned off her flashlight. In the distance, she could see the old abandoned school. The school was surrounded by metal chain-link fences with more signs of private property. She ignored them and began looking for a way in. After feeling the fence and pulling on different directions, eventually she found a corner that she was able to lift up and squeeze through. As the fence fell back down into place, it jingled, causing Jess to quickly grip her fingers against the large holes and trying to stop the sound from traveling. As the chain link ringing stopped, she began to move to the entrance of the abandoned school. She was yet again greeted by a sign on the door, but instead of the same trespassing warning, it instead contained the Forest Service logo and in small text read a warning to campers and tourists. It stated, "Increase satanic cult activity," and warned them to stay away from specific areas of the forest. Is this a joke? Jess whispered to herself. But she was determined to find answers and reached for the doorknob. To her surprise, the door freely and easily swung open. As Jess entered the building, the smell of pure death caused her to gag and shove her nose into her arm. She continued walking with her arm tightly pushed against her face. She made her way down the hall, which brought her to a split in the building, one left and the other going right. This was obviously different wings of the school. She noticed the hallway on the left door was chained up heavy with rusted irons. She looked at the right hallway door, and yet again as she reached, it swung open and free. She finally removed her arm from her face as her body became used to the smell. The hallway looked that of a normal American school. There was lockers on both sides, followed by classrooms between each set. She tried each door as she continued down the hallway, but they all remained locked. Even though not top of mind, deep down she felt a little relief after trying each door and it remaining closed. It lessened the chances of her finding anything, which deep down she wanted nothing more than this to be an abandoned school. However, again, the calming feeling would only be moments before fear and panic seeped back in. Jess eventually made her way to the end of the hallway, where she found a large old wooden door with round iron loops which you needed to pull to open. It was completely out of place for the building, and reminded her of doors that you would see in movies about castles and knights. As her hand slowly gripped around the ring, her heart now slamming against her chest, she tried to pull slowly, but the weight of the door caused her to have to use two hands and quite a bit of strength to pry the door free. She opened it just enough for her to barely fit through. As she entered the room, her knees began to give way as the horror caused her legs to tremble and feel weak. The room was lit with candles large and small. The same symbol she saw on the tree was now displayed on every wall, ceiling, and floor. In the center of the room, a large slab of stone, which could only be described as an altar. The stone stained with brown and red. Laying tied on top of the altar was a naked man. On his body appeared multiple cuts, similar to the dead woman just found in the woods. The man slowly turned, now facing the nearly collapsed Forest Service woman, and let out a whimper. "Please help me." Even with the fear causing her legs to feel like noodles, she slowly moved each leg one at a time to try to help the man. As she got closer, the wounds now appeared larger, with more blood staining the man's white skin reddish brown. As Jess tried to figure out what to do next, she heard the giant wooden door slam shut. She quickly turned and looked. Her eyes began to widen as a familiar face stood in front of the now closed door. "Hello, Jessica. Jess," the old sheriff said with a smile on his face. Even in shock, she instinctively reached for a compact Smith & Wesson M&P in her pocket and pointed it at the uniformed sheriff. "Whoa, settle down now," the old man said, raising his hand slowly and walking towards her. Before Jess could even decide what to do next, a deep and familiar voice called from behind. "Put the gun down," Jacob said, with a Glock pointed at her back. Just as she began to turn around and look at her boss, the sheriff quickly snatched the gun from her hands, causing her to fall off balance and lean on the wounded man. He let out a groan as she quickly regained her balance. "What the hell is going on?" Jess said with anger in her voice. The two men began to laugh, only causing her anger to turn white hot. As she began to curse the men out, figures began emerging from doors she didn't even notice. Each figure's face slowly becoming clear as they entered the candlelight. Yet again, she was met with familiar eyes and smiles gazing upon her. The first one she noticed was the owner of a store in town. She often stopped at his store, always made friendly conversations about the mountain and work. She always thought that he was a very sweet man. Every face in the crowd was someone she knew from town, rather another officer, a neighbor, or even a tow truck driver. In complete shock, the only reaction she could muster was tears. "Don't cry, Jess," Daniel the sheriff said as he put one free hand on the woman's shoulders and gave her a big smile. "You're one of us. You serve this town. You love this town. And we all love you," the man said, still smiling. Jess's tears began to stop, but her mind flooded with thoughts, mostly trying to figure out what was going to happen next. "Jacob, bring it," the old man said with authority, and Jacob quickly brought a shiny object and placed it in the sheriff's hands. As Jess peered down on the item, it was quickly recognized as a knife. However, the knife was not like any she's ever seen before. The hilt was wrapped in black leather. Large claws, which looked like bear claws, laid side by side with the blade running down the middle. "Take it," Daniel said, still pointing Jess's gun back at her. She slowly picked up the knife, thinking about shoving it into the white-haired man's face. Daniel now put both hands on her shoulders and spun her around. "Put him out of his misery," the man whispered into her ear. "No," Jess whispered back. "You must, or you will be next," Daniel said louder. The room began to erupt with chanting. The only words Jess could make out was "save" and "together." "Do it," the man scoffed, then yelled, "Do it." In utter terror, Jess quickly plunged the blade into the man's chest. The man's eyes widened, and he groaned until no more air was left in his lungs. The crowd now began to clap and cheer. Jess's eyes began to water once again, and the man whispered into her ears and said, "See, one of us." At this point of Jess telling me this story, for the first time I could ever recall, she was not smiling. She only looked down at her empty wine glass, and after a few moments of silence, she finally forced a smile. She explained that ever since that day, she's been a part of a group of select people from the town. They believe that the forest has a gate to the underworld, and the only thing stopping the fires of hell from spilling over is a continuous cycle of sacrifices. She even said that the group believes some of the most major forest fires that has ever happened was caused from the gate, and the group failing to continue their ritual on time. She did say she never had to kill again, but she did have to help capture tourists, which would lead to their deaths. As we sat there for a while, barely talking, I forced a smile and said she had to do what she had to do to save her own life. She smiled back, and the night was pretty much done. I walked her to the front door, and right before she left, she turned and said one final thought. "I've seen it, you know." I was perplexed and confused, so I asked her, "Seen what?" She replied, "The gate. It's real."